I mean, I think it is a debate that's going on here, especially at the BA program, when you leave thinking, okay, what can I do with this education now? What does it allow me to do or not? And I think I think Nick has really kind of advocated for this, to highlight the plurality of possibilities. So to also highlight that people might be going into education, people might be using it to do workshops, that you don't necessarily even need to be on the path of everyone's got to be an artist. That's the first thing to say. I think the expectation maybe at MA level is more focused, and there's not so much evidence that people say, I'm not here to make art in any way. That's not really happening so much. But yeah, then there is the question of what is our relationship to the market, and then perhaps to identify, well, what are the different markets? Because there's also very clearly people that come to do Soda that have no intention of staying in Berlin and want to go somewhere else. So this is why it gets tricky. It's like, so what should we do as an education establishment? Only train people to know how to write applications for the Senat in Berlin? Many of them will never write a German application, because they're doing their course in English, and that means getting German, or means always paying to have translations done. And this is something that the careers advice service of the UDK offers. So why should we have to offer that too? But I think much more interesting is to have a much wider intellectual debate about what should education be doing. For instance, I'm personally much more interested in how could you begin to understand that the kind of work that you're doing has a future, has some kind of sustainability. How do you make sure you don't fall necessarily into the trap of always feeling that you're going to have to secure outside funding and still feel like you're in a long-term creative process? Because there's horrible holes in the performance world. Like, you stop a product, you work on projects, right? That's the paradigm of the market. You work on projects, and then the project stops, and then if you haven't, during that project, also been writing something for the next project, there's a bloody great big hole. And what do you do with that hole? How do you not fall down through it? How do you have something that actually makes you, throughout all of that time, have some kind of trajectory or vector towards other modes of working? And that interests me much, much more than how can we service the market in some way. I'm not really interested in how you should feel within an education program that you've got to get back into that. And there's plenty of people throughout their MA that are working professionally and still doing stuff for festivals. That's still going on, but they were doing it before and they will do it afterwards. And then there's the thing that's in every single art environment, of that of competition. There were some people that were incredibly savvy during their time at the HZT and managed to wangle every opportunity that was within the education facility to a very market-driven way of working, and that worked extremely well for them. There were other people that were very removed from that world, very unconfident, and they might be some of the best performers. That's the super frustrating thing from the outside, is to see often and I'm a bit wary of using the word talented, but actually I'm going to dare to use it, very talented performers who are not necessarily the people that are very good at marketing themselves, or even worse, and this is a political point, come from the wrong country. That breaks my heart to see time and time again that when you finish an educational establishment, there's certain countries that are going to throw a heck of a lot of money at you because you come from that country, and you can live like a king in Berlin because you happen to be lucky enough to be from Switzerland or a Scandinavian country. And if you happen to come from Spain or Poland, and if you're not in an educational program, that country's not remotely interested. You're living abroad. Why should they fund anything that you're doing? So I see that kind of inequality all the time. So I understand why people get bitter and annoyed, because it's bloody unfair. For instance, there's a politics already that should be going on between how are the existing institutions in Berlin talking to each other or not. That's a massive problem. For instance, I think many times I think it's interesting to see that the Mac students are starting to show their work outside of the Wolfer Studios, in completely different venues throughout the city. Many times I've thought, what would it be to see all of the Soda works again at the Sophia or how? What would it do? How would the audience react to the work there? Has it been made in a bubble for a certain community? What does it do to test that work and put it in a very different context? And people like Magdalena Dan or Larissa, who take the work then back to the country where they were working before, so that be Bucharest or to Zagreb, then that's super fascinating to see outside of the context of here. What does it do to the work? And that, for me, that is also being engaged in a kind of politics of not only having an affinity for your peer group and saying, I want my community in another country to see this kind of work, to open up and to start some kind of debates, but also even within Berlin, like this institution is here to be integrated into an independent scene. How much are those people coming here? How much are we going there? What is that kind of balance? What are the conversations that are happening? I mean, I went many times to different corporation meetings, and I was kind of shocked about who wasn't there, really. I mean, how little interest there is. And yet, if you open up a brochure to do with Berlin and you see how many are alumni HZT students that are actually making work in How or Sophia and Zila, it's phenomenal. It's quite dominant. And someone said to me the other day, you know, you'd be pretty hard pushed to come from the outside now, having had nothing to do with the HZT, and try and start your career within the dance and performance field. Not being associated is kind of tough, actually. And suddenly seeing it through those people's eyes, I was like, ooh, okay, yeah, maybe you're right. I hadn't really thought of what that actually might be like, and how in the last 10 years it's become quite dominant, actually. But interestingly, there's a certain kind of, it seems to be a certain kind of resilience, ambition and drive to make sure that work continues, gets the funding and gets to those kind of venues. And I'm not sure, you know, there could be other modes of collaborating with that market specifically, I feel. And of course there's a lot of work to be done to relate to where we are here, which I know that the Orpheus are dealing with, but I wonder how the HZT could also get involved in where are we. Because sometimes I bump into people that I know from an entirely different context that have somehow landed up here. It happened to me once. Someone that I knew from an entirely different context from like 15 years ago, worked in a cafe, and he was standing in the courtyard here going, what is this? Where have I landed? I don't understand anything. And it was so great actually to have someone who was not part of the club, that just had no clue, and then trying to enter into it, and actually dealing with them being annoyed, frustrated, feeling left out, because so much of what we're doing nowadays, and I think it's really true, like we go looking for information that already backs up the opinion that we already have. So there is very little kind of coming into conflict with other people that have radically different opinions to us. So those kind of it's not just an engagement, but sort of, it was a kind of a clash. You know, or I invited someone from a very different kind of workshop to come and see the work that was happening here, because he said, I love going to the theatre, and I thought, I wonder if he considers this theatre of what's going on here, or what does it do to his understanding of regularly going to the theatre. And he came from engineering, like people that come from a really different world, like what do they make of what's going on here? And I think that is important to keep checking that, to keep checking, am I just engaging with things that just back up my own opinion in some way? And it's sometimes hard to do, because there's also, there's an incredible comfort in feeling, our identity is us feeling very similar. Yeah, I think quite often the term that gets used around soda is body-based practice, to encompass as much as possible. But, I totally agree with you that it's a really, really grey zone, fuzzy area, difficult. I mean, there's all sorts of political, financial reasons as to why it is the way it is. I've personally been searching and longing for a course that has performance in the title in Berlin for a very long time, and don't know if it's ever going to exist. And then the question is, after the question that you just put, why would I want that in the title more than the word dance? And it's just to do with what you feel you know. So I mean, being in a dance context has actually taken me out of my comfort zone. And maybe there's something really good about that, of putting you outside of your comfort zone, and you learn a lot of, like, it was an opportunity for the last 5 years for me to say, okay, well, what can happen under that banner? And of course I've learned an enormous amount of what that could be. And also I knew the performer Stammtisch people, so I kind of regularly went with the things that were happening there. And within that, there was often people that were very kind of anti-dance within that. And I could imagine also that there's a dance scene here that feels that the Hatzati is also not embracing, I mean, there's another term that I've not heard for a long, long time, but pure dance. I don't know if they think it's pure dance going on. I think there's also a discrepancy and difference, perhaps in a good way, between the BA program and the MA program. I think there's an understanding that there has to be some level of training going on at BA level, whereas at the MA level it's entirely optional. So if you come here and you're someone that's really clear that you feel you don't have the same level of knowledge as your peers in terms of body-based practice, there is the opportunity to do a lot of training. And you might choose to do that. But there's other people that perhaps don't have that level of training and still don't want to do it, because under that term for them is something else that they want to explore. Be that conceptual, be that also physical, that there's a very different idea of what for them dance is and can be. So, I don't know, I think it is an issue, and I wonder if the political situation will change enough to just allow that to be in the title. I think there will come a time, I have a feeling, I'm not really going to be able to properly predict the future, but I think there will come a time when the title Soda may change. And it'll be interesting because, of course, there's pressure for there to be separate identities. That the Hatzati has two MA programs that clearly have two different identities, and that the BA has a different identity, and that's important for a university that is not just all one mishmash. At the same time, it really is important that there's still some kind of crossover, and there's new ways being found all the time about how can you get those different programs to talk to each other, or to even have some kind of insight or understanding into how that other program's working. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question about dance and performance, but I don't know. I don't have an ultimate answer about that, really. I just think that it is an issue.
Do you think that it is fruitful to continue
debating it? Yeah, sometimes I'm really intrigued as to why certain people still want to push what it is that they're exploring under the banner dance. What does it do for your work to be in that? Is it just that this is the place that offers you the opportunity that comes as near as you can possibly get to what it is that you want to do? Or are you really genuinely interested in the term dance? So I don't know. And sometimes with some students it's really fruitful to push that, and other times it's just not. It depends on the person and what they've come here for in some way, really. And when you were talking, I realised, how do I feel the Hatzati identity, branding, or what was the word we used, or mission statement, how do I feel that? And if I'm really honest, I only understand it, maybe it's because I've been too involved for too long, in not that. So when the S&DOs come, I go, oh no, it's not that. And maybe when another course comes and presents their work, you go, oh, it's clearly not that. And that's, if I'm honest, that's also how all sorts of identities work. My own sense of, when you talk about nationhood, you say, oh, clearly not that, or not that, or not that. But that's much easier than actually to say what you are. And you've kind of highlighted for me how tricky that is. That much easier to say, we're clearly not that, we're clearly not that, we're clearly not that. But then, so what are you then? Still tricky to put my finger at, say we're only this and we only work in this way and we all agree about this, because I don't know if there really is a clear shared vision and synergy for what this place is. If we have to say that we're something, aren't we that? If we're embracing lots and lots of different disciplines, and what does it do to then say the Hatzati is an institution that is engaged in the practice of investigating an expanded choreography? And it was a term that became very interesting for me to ask in terms of the kind of work that I make with Dan under the name Plan B, of like, okay, we've had this practice of recording everywhere we go. What if we were to consider that as a kind of choreography in relationship to a city? What if we're, I don't know if I would go as far as talking about dance, but certainly, this tiny little scribble that I'm doing on Earth with a GPS is only possible by the larger choreography of the orbiting satellites. Like, what is this large movement in relationship to my tiny movement on Earth? And then it's beyond the studio, So what does that do if I understand movement as global movement, or movement as beyond a gesture that I can do within a room? And that began to really kind of excite me, actually, if I'm honest, that notion of who and how, what does it do to then understand your own work within an expanded choreography, and to understand also that other artists that have nothing to do with dance are also talking about their work being engaged with, investigating the politics and the choreography, perhaps even of goods, politically. How do we get the things that we have now, and how complex it's become that half the shops that you ask, where does this thing come from, can't even tell you anymore. They can't even trace their own chain of people. So the most simple thing, the act of buying food and drink, is an incredibly complex set of choreographies and connections that most people can't trace anymore. So I found that whole debate around the Heart City potentially maybe a way of talking about an identity, but I think it needs to then be opened out further to the rest of the Heart City to say, does what you do fit within that kind of model? And if not, why not? And what are the exceptions? Where does it become inclusive? Where is it exclusive? Is that a useful term? And if it's a useful term, how do we bring it in regularly, pedagogically? So there's kind of an effort, or rather there's often an interest in students that have studied something else before. I think that sometimes gives people the edge, I have to admit. So when you know someone studied medicine or anthropology, you think, well, what questions have they got of dance now? Or you have someone that's come purely from photography, and now they're interested in movement. And I think those kind of coming from one medium into another makes us kind of curious about them often. And to be honest, always had terrific experiences, like totally fascinating for us also, as someone that has been teaching here a lot, to find out what does an economics student make of the dialogues that are going on here, or what does somebody that's come from circus or from a completely different field, how do you understand yourself within this other frame, and then how can you actually, with the work that you bring, also push that frame? So I think that's the kind of interesting tension. That's the only thing I can think of generally, and I don't know, compared to other places, I'd say there's quite a high level of maturity. It is quite rare to be, especially on the MA programs, it's quite rare to be very young. It doesn't happen that often.
To be?
Very young. It's normally sort of, I would say, late 20s to mid 30s, but we've had people up into their 50s. And that also makes a difference to an MA program. And in America and in Britain, you're quite often in your early 20s. And you're kind of trying to get through your education as quick as possible because you're getting into a lot of debt. So you just kind of do your BA and your MA all together. That's what I did, because I knew that I was going to cause a problem if I didn't do it like that. So that level of maturity and that different stages of people's lives and different interests, that's kind of part of the melting pot of the Heart City, I'd say. Honestly, no. And I think, or I hope, that maybe the statement would be to learn from what those people begin to understand, or what it is for them. So I hope that there really is truly an openness to what those people are going to define for them. I think sometimes there's a suspicion, especially I've noticed it on the BA program, of this feeling of like, 1 minute, I think there's a certain group that have decided what they know what contemporary dance is, and I'm not in it. There's often this feeling of like there's a core group that really come from and belong to a contemporary dance scene, and then there's kind of people that feel like satellites somehow on the outside. And I sometimes feel that kind of tension and don't quite know how you would negotiate those kind of differences, or those people that feel like it's the program's sometimes not speaking to them, or they don't quite find their way in or through.
And this tension you mean within the students, or also the staff, the teachers and the...
No, I think both. Well, because of course the staff are often deciding what the program is, and and the program's often defined by who's being invited to teach here, and what kind of things are they bringing in. And if you feel constantly like that it's not actually somehow initially speaking to you, then you can quite often feel like, where's my place in this? and also with your peer group. And I think that can be tricky for a while. I think it takes time to arrive here and settle in and find your way through. And I think we tried quite hard on Soda to make a kind of group dynamic. So you build, and that's much easier with 8 students, or on the other end maybe with 6 students and with 17. It's just logistics, it's just, there's other possibilities that are open to you if you've got a smaller group of people. But the idea with all the kind of input that they have in the first year is that they have lots of time together, but they also negotiate how that time's going to be spent together and find out, like, interesting, that person's becoming from that perspective. From my work, I'd be really interested in this specific aspect. You kind of find out how you can, it doesn't sound very good to say use each other, but in a way, how can you use each other for the things you want to discover whilst you're here? When you were speaking, I was thinking, interesting, what's the difference between work in progress and a research showing? Because when I was making work back in Britain before I moved here, we always did kind of work in progress. Because, one of the things that makes sense for a lot of people is to use your time in Soda as a 2-year process. And the 6 modules that you have to go through, one of the ways in which you can deal with it is you're actually involved in one process, and all you're doing is showing different excerpts from that long, thin investigation that you're undertaking. Because many people are super frustrated with the market of this 6 weeks, another product, and they want to step out of that, which I totally understand. So what does it do in order to have something that you can explore for 2 years? You've got the time, you've got the space, you've got the facilities. What happens if you can do things in a different time frame? At the same time, how the hell do you take pressure off people? How do you make them feel that time and space? Because I think within a kind of modular system, they just, sometimes you feel as well that you're still pulling them through another treadmill of like, I've got to produce another thing and another thing and another thing. And the first public showing that they do in these research showings, so it's like a double whammy. It's the first time they show something publicly, and then you can't quite step out of this need of wanting to have something polished or product-like, because you feel like a public's going to come and look at it, and therefore it could be a selling point, it could be an opportunity. I don't know what kind of pressures, but in the conversations that I've often been in, I've been actually trying to encourage people to embrace things like fragments. Like, don't feel you have to present a whole, break the thing up and show me parts. And I think an audience, if they see a bunch of parts, potentially can start to make interesting connections in their head about how these things might go together. And also the framing statement, like where you place that within a research. Are you going to do that before, during, after, throughout? Like, what that does for a public. And I think there is a need, or an interest rather, in a different form of sharing work. So I think there is a really genuinely different audience that comes to research showing and come to the final things. And I get the impression, although I have no concrete evidence, that sometimes it's also the community of makers are potentially more interested in the research and how would you do that than perhaps the final products. It's not so much of the final products, of course, that there's going to be curators and dramaturgs and producers and other people there for all sorts of reasons, and people just curious about what does this program do, what kind of work does it produce, as well as your peers and your family, your friends and your community. But I think the research sharing is a real challenge, to actually challenge the kind of work that you're doing and what is the form that allows that not to feel like a product, and how to get out of the product mode of thinking, perhaps even. I think that's for a lot of people really, really tricky.
And do you think that the program is encouraging this struggle?
Yeah, I hope so. That's really something that we have strived to do for a long time. There's been some kind of decisions that we've made that for many students have made it feel a bit too short. So we give a longer period quite often over the semester break to work on an exam, so that they come back and do an exam in April. And then if you've got a research presentation in July, that time kind of gets condensed somewhat, so you feel like you mostly just have May and June. And maybe you'd need a longer block of time to get into really questioning modes of researching and modes of sharing research. And maybe there could be other ways of opening that out somehow. Or what would it do, for instance, not to have it in July, but have it in September or early October, to give much more time to that. There's a danger you can get lost, but maybe getting lost can also be useful. I mean, I think that's something that part of the argument for that is that in order for it to be within an educational frame, that is the thing that's kind of being tested in some way. That is the thing that's also being practiced. How do you talk to your work, and how does the work talk to you? What is this relationship between the two things? And I take your point that it's sometimes really, really hard to do that at the same time. And I particularly feel it now, like I could particularly, having witnessed in the last few weeks that struggle exactly with several people. I understand how tricky that is to have the confidence as a maker to say, I'm interested in something's going on. I don't know what it is yet, but I trust that it's the right direction to be going in. So there's that journey to be going on, and at the same time to say, the pressure to say, what is it? What is it that you're exactly doing? So I understand that that's a very tricky thing to bring together. So someone like Robert Wilson, who will always refuse to ever say what it is that he's doing, and that's part of his shtick, that's part of his performance. Whenever he gives an artist talk, he'll say, I don't know what it is. And he's of such a caliber that he can carry that and insist on that. And he's also not in an educational program, so he doesn't have to. Artists don't always have to be utterly accountable. So yes, it is a tool potentially to in the most neoliberal way, it's a way to practice pitching what it is you do to other people. Although we give people more than 3 minutes, we give them 15. The really cruel neoliberal, particularly the film world, it wants the 3-minute pitch. What is it? But rather than that, I hope what's going on is, how do you first and foremost articulate that to yourself? And I guess that's the really tricky thing. Like, what kind of knowledge is produced for you? And I mean, if I think about that, even for my own practice, super tough. I can't answer that question half the time anyway either. So I completely understand how tricky that is to do. And I also see the difference, as you just put it, between the kind of conversation that happens after their final presentation, that happens normally in December, which we have normally in February, called the Viva, where they speak to the work that they made several months ago. And that conversation, with time, with reflection, having written a thesis, having made a workbook, how that goes compared to the hitting the road running in the research kind of context. And then quite often the research presentation ended up being this hybrid lecture performance, right? So how did you also open up what a research presentation could be that's not just lecture performance? How could it still have some kind of practice, how could it actually have some kind of real experimentation and performance material in there, and not just be a kind of just back and forth, talking, doing, or be a different form from the one that we know. Yeah, I take your point. It's a super tough thing to do, and maybe there is something to say about separating those two things. I think quite often students that really struggle, that are particularly, for instance, shy or nervous about doing that live, have chosen other formats. So I know that Yaron is really challenging the form by tomorrow having a durational performance, a durational live drawing, and a written text. And I know some people work also with voiceover and work with other ways of presenting that kind of framing statement that means, God, the kind of performance material that I make requires me to be in a certain mental state, and I can't step out of that mental state and give a talk. So how do you then negotiate what you're going to say and how you're going to say it? And then part of the feedback that we give often on the kind of commission is was that a good decision to make? Would it be more interesting for you to challenge yourself to do it live, or was that a good tactic to even sometimes just have a written statement that someone else can read? And of course, a written statement gives the kind of reflection that you were talking about, but it also requires sometimes writing it before you finish making some of the research. So that's the tricky thing. That, literally this this chronology between practice and reflecting on practice.